It's my pleasure to turn over the speech to Rebecca Turner from USAID. She is a senior supply chain technical advisor, and she will be introducing the speaker, and she'll also be moderating the discussion after the presentation. So I pass it off to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John, and carrying on the sentiments, wishing everyone a happy new year. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this webinar. As you may or may not already be aware, USAID's 2022 to 2030 climate strategy has set forth our agency priorities for responding to and addressing the climate crisis. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions and advancing climate resilience in agency supply chains is a critical step in line with this agency priority. And our climate strategy's objectives are to decrease emissions from transport, energy, health, and other systems, as well as improve climate resilience for populations in partner countries. Thus, USAID's Global Health Bureau, Jan Miller, Xavier Tomsej, and I worked with Environmental Compliance Support and ICF to establish a greenhouse gas emissions baseline for the USAID Global Health supply chain, which included our family planning and reproductive health programs. By identifying, quantifying, analyzing, and reporting on GHG emissions from the global health supply chain contract activities. Intercity Fund, ICF, is a global technical, economic, and policy advisory service firm with 8,000 employees whose mission is to build a more prosperous and resilient world for all. ICF supports all federal agencies, as well as commercial, state, local, and non-governmental clients. Over 2,000 of ICF's consultants focus on energy, the environment, and climate change. The company has been carbon neutral since 2006, has set a science-based target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and is one of only 250 companies on CDP's A-list, which is a not-for-profit charity that runs the global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, and regions to manage their environmental impact. I'm pleased to introduce you our speaker today, Chris Stoyer. He's a climate change and sustainability professional with nearly 20 years of experience advising and guiding corporations, federal agencies, and higher education institutions on greenhouse gas accounting and management approaches, net zero energy and emissions strategy, and sustainable programs and solutions. In addition to USAID, Chris has developed greenhouse gas management tools, resources, and strategies for federal clients, including the National Park Service, Millennium Challenge Corporation, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. House of Representatives. So it's my pleasure now to hand it over to him to present our global health supply chain baseline assessment, from which strategies with specified goals can be developed for us to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks so much. Over to you, Chris.
All right. Thank you very much, Becky and John, Sophia, and thank you to the Reproductive Health Supplies Coalition for allowing us today to share a bit about the work we've been doing to, as Becky said, address climate change and global health. Our Global Health Bureau with USAID, and the work we've been doing to baseline greenhouse gas emissions in the USAID Global Health supply chain. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that work. To do so, what we like to do is provide overall sort of background and context for the greenhouse gas analyses that we've been conducting for global health. And then we'll get into some detail around the specific analyses that we've been conducting, beginning with a focus on an analysis that looked at port-to-port or shipping-related emissions, and then also talking about emission estimates that we're looking at for the broader value chain beyond just shipping emissions. And then we'll also sort of close with a discussion around opportunities for thinking about emission reduction strategies or opportunities for mitigation within the supply chain. So as Becky noted in her introduction, USAID has established a target to reduce its operational greenhouse gas emissions by 65% by 2030 relative to a 2008 baseline, and to be net zero by 2050. And this goal focuses on operational greenhouse gas emissions, on emissions that result primarily from USAID's direct footprint, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means. But there's also this goal to be net zero, and then within it, working to reduce the global supply chain carbon footprint. So the work that we've been focused on with global health, and that I'll be sharing today, really sort of zeroes in on those efforts, the efforts to think about carbon within the supply chain and opportunities to account for it, and then ultimately position USAID for reducing those emissions. So in order to be able to talk about the emissions within the supply chain, it's helpful to have just a general understanding of greenhouse gas accounting, of where emissions are coming from, and how you essentially conduct an inventory of those emissions. So what we're looking at here is the way we think about emissions and sources of greenhouse gas emissions from an accounting standpoint. And you've probably seen graphics similar to this in the past. When you look at accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, you break out those emissions into different scopes. So the sources of emissions kind of bucket into different scopes. And we begin with scope 1, which is direct emissions. So direct emissions are emissions that occur from sources that an entity or an organization owns or controls. The easiest way to think about this is that if you own and operate a building, and that building has a boiler in it, that boiler uses natural gas, let's say, you own the building, you own the boiler, you own the natural gas, and therefore those emissions are very direct for you, or they are direct emissions, and we group those sources of direct emissions into scope 1. But then you can also look at other emissions that occur from other sources that maybe other organizations or other entities own, but they occur as a result of your activities. And those are called indirect emissions. We begin with scope 2 emissions, where the first indirect emission source is purchased electricity. If you're using electricity in your home, it's that activity that creates the demand for electricity, and therefore you're somewhat responsible for the emissions associated with them, but the emissions are occurring upstream at the power plant where the electricity is being generated. And so it's an indirect emission source, but the emissions occur as a result of your activities. We group that sort of large indirect emission source of purchased electricity and steam into scope 2. And then there are lots of other types of activities that result in emissions that are indirect. And we group these into 15 different source categories and put those into a scope 3 bucket. So those emissions, those indirect scope 3 emissions, range from category 1, purchased goods and services, all the way to investments in number 15. And you can further differentiate those into upstream activities and downstream activities. So from a greenhouse gas accounting standpoint, this is how we think about all the different emissions that result from an entity's activities or operations, and how to organize them. For U.S. federal agencies, historically, there's been a primary focus on scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then also a limited set of scope 3 emissions, those being waste generation, business travel, and employee commuting, that are historically included within a federal agency's greenhouse gas inventory, according to the guidance that agencies follow per executive order mandates for their own accounting. And so looking at these core direct emissions, scope 2, and then some scope 3 sources. That same sort of approach was, let's say, customary for other entities, other organizations, for corporations and companies really for quite a while, up until maybe 5 to 10 years ago, when there started to be a focus on expanding the view into the broader value chain, looking at those other scope 3 emission sources and starting to include them within organization's greenhouse gas inventory. This effort is highlighted in a 2021 CDP report, wherein they surveyed over 150 organizations that were participating in their CDP supply chain program and looked at the emissions from these organizations as those organizations expanded their view of what they would include in an inventory. And specifically, they looked at supply chain emissions. So within scope 3, these 4 categories that you see over on the left-hand side of the slide. What they found is that as you're doing that, as you're widening the view and you're starting to look at emissions within the supply chain, often those emissions can be quite a bit larger than the emissions from just scope 1 and 2 from those more direct activities. So this and other efforts kind of raised interest in widening that view and starting to account for emissions across what we would call the value chain, all of those other 15 scope 3 emission sources. And so this is happening quite a bit for, as I said, for corporations within the private sector, but then also the US federal government has been starting to move in that direction as well. So Executive Order 14057, released in December of 2021, had various requirements or expectations of federal agencies, but among them, it called for agencies to pursue procurement strategies that reduce contractor emissions and specifically embodied emissions in products or that were acquired through federal efforts, through federal agencies and projects. So what we would call kind of the direction of travel, the movement is towards federal agencies also starting to look at that, what's in the supply chain, what are the emissions within the supply chain. This was also sort of indicated within a proposed amendment to the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR, by the federal government, to specifically for contractors to begin to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions as well as risks associated with climate change, and then to also set science-based emission reduction targets. So this proposed amendment to the FAR would require specifically that larger contractors or contractors that do over $50 million worth of work with the federal government, that they disclose their scope 1 and 2 emissions, as well as relevant scope 3 emission sources publicly to a disclosure organization like specifically CDP. And so all of this is to say that what's required and what's conventional among federal agencies is to look at sort of those core emissions and sometimes some expanded view of some scope 3 emissions. Where things are moving is to widen that view and look more broadly at emissions within the supply chain. So the work that USAID Global Health has been focused on is beginning to look there, beginning to try and understand what emissions within the supply chain look like, how to account for them, get a sense of the scale of emissions. And this began with what we've called the port-to-port analysis. So the port-to-port analysis accounted for transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions associated with global health shipments from USAID custody to in-country port of entry. And this would be all air, land, and sea shipments and the emissions associated with moving goods as part of those shipments. When we think about those possible scope 3 emission source categories, this activity falls into category 4, upstream transportation and distribution, and specifically outbound transportation and distribution services that are purchased in this case by USAID. So again, it's sort of widening that view, starting to look at additional emission sources and thinking about how do we go about estimating emissions from these transportation related or shipping activities? So we began to approach this effort by beginning with the types of data that are currently available to be able to estimate those emissions. So the data aren't captured with the express intent of estimating emissions, but if we also look at ways in which that we can estimate emissions, the methods that are available, we can look at the methods and then look at the types of data that USAID Global Health is already capturing and see what's possible in terms of matching the data to methods to be able to estimate the emissions. And what we found is that the data that were being captured for tracking shipping activities already were quite robust and were really supportive of being able to estimate emissions. So wanted to talk a little bit about the information that was available. First off, we would have shipment information for all air, land, and sea shipments. We focused in on 2019 as a base year for calculating those emissions, and that's consistent with the base year that USAID is using for other estimation activities. We had information on the shipment weights, about 43,000 tons of products were shipped during 2019. We had information on shipment volumes, and that's available for and important for sea shipments. And then we also had origin destination information for these shipments, and looking at them, there were about 700 unique shipment routes that these products were moving across. That also helped or allowed us to understand, where the products going, how far are they traveling. And then lastly, within the data, it also differentiated between whether they were moving in refrigerated or non-refrigerated containers. So we had a good sense of the data that were already available and that Global Health was already capturing, and we could crosswalk that against available methods. As I had mentioned earlier, for a federal agency, and there's actually specific accounting methods that federal agencies use to estimate emissions, but they don't address supply chain or transportation related emissions for shipping because that hadn't historically been required of federal agencies. Fortunately, however, within the private sector and the World Resources Institute through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides methods and standards for accounting for these emissions for companies to follow. So we're able to look at those methodologies, match them to the data that's available through USAID Global Health, and identify an approach for estimating the emissions. Specifically, there are different sort of methods that are available as sort of captured in the table in the bottom right of the slide, breaking out into spend-based, distance-based, and fuel-based methods. We sort of keyed in on that distance-based method, wherein what you're looking at is how heavy are the products and how far are they moving, and you can use that sort of mass distance relationship to match it to available emission factors that are available within the literature to then go ahead and estimate shipping related emissions using a distance-based method. So the work that we were involved in begins with that. It's looking at the data, it's looking at the methods that are available, it's matching those, and then it's trying to work within the data to further enhance them to be able to calculate emissions. And so when we looked at the shipment data set for air, sea, and land, what we have is origin destination information. So we have to use that information to calculate the actual distances traveled. So part of the work was to be able to, to go out and calculate those distances using available data sets. So I wanted to highlight some of what is available for others if you're also interested in kind of following similar approaches to prepare these emission estimates. What we found was for air, the U.S. Department of Transportation provides a data set that provides average flight distances associated with airport codes. So if you know where things are leaving from and where they're ending up, and you have the airports, you can use the airport codes within this to be able to obtain flight distances. So you have that distance information. We use shipping distance calculators, which look at the sort of optimized average shipping route that would be followed by sea vessels to be able to calculate the distance there for associated with the origin destinations of the products that are being shipped. And then for land, we were just using Google Maps to calculate an optimized shipping route as well. So through that, we were able to develop these distances for routes to support the calculation. What we found is that for air, this Department of Transportation data set accounted for about 75% of the flights that were used. And then for the remaining ones, about 80% of those were accommodated, or about 80% of the weight of what was being moved was within an additional 55 flights. So we estimated those flight distances separately. But I think what came out of it is that we had a pretty good understanding of, or pretty good mapping of the amount of product weight that was being moved matched to flight distances that we were able to develop. So again, going back to that kind of mass distance method, we had pretty good data to support estimating emissions for flights. And then for sea shipments, there were about over 700 unique routes that were traveled, but just under 300 of them accounted for about 90% of the shipped product weight. And so similarly for sea, we were able to account and have a pretty good estimate of the distance that was traveled, a map to the majority of the products that were being shipped. And then a smaller amount of shipments occurred over land, and we were able to calculate those distances again using Google Maps. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the metrics and calculations that were actually then used. So in the first half of this process is getting that mass distance information, and then once that's available, you can map that to emission factors that are publicly available for each one of the modes, the air, sea, and land. And so for air, the UK Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy provides emission factors for flights that are based on the flight distance and would break out by the relevant greenhouse gases, so by carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, and allow us to estimate emissions. So I wanted to share some of the emission factors that we were used, again, in the interest if you're trying to sort of replicate similar emission estimates. One item that we found as we were looking at that is that the majority, and not surprisingly, the majority of flights are long-haul flights, because you're moving products all over the world as part of USAID's mission. And so the majority of the estimates are sort of mapped to a long-haul emission factor. And this is important for flights because the majority of emissions associated with air travel occur from landing and takeoff. And so you end up being more emissive on a distance basis for short flights versus long flights. So longer flights are going to be less emissive on an intensity basis overall. So it's important to have an understanding of the different emission factors that are available for these calculations. And then for the sea freight calculations, the BSR, the Business Social Responsibility, provided a report that provided emission factors in 20 equivalent units, or in TEU, so volume, distance, emission factors that are available based on different shipping routes. And so we're able to match those emission factors to the distances by routes that we had available through the shipping data set. And then also, and importantly, these emission factors differentiate between whether the containers are refrigerated or non-refrigerated, because the refrigerated ones would be more energy intensive. They're also going to be using refrigerants, which are themselves greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases that heat the atmosphere very effectively. So they're much more effective and have a higher, it's a global warming potential, but a higher factor, a higher coefficient for heating the atmosphere than gases like carbon dioxide. So it's really important that we're able to sort of differentiate whether it's refrigerated or non-refrigerated and consider that, because the refrigerator would have those higher emissions. So able to get into fairly high resolution with the mapping to emission factors that were available through this report for sea shipping. And then similarly, this source, the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, provides emission factors for land shipments as well, based on different types of vehicles, and we were using the heavy goods vehicles for shipments for land. Just to note some of the assumptions that go into that methodology. So the first is that if you recall back to the slide where I was showing the methods that are available, there were different tiers of methods ranging from a spend-based, distance-based, and then a fuel-based method. Ideally, in a best-case scenario, you use a fuel-based method to estimate the emissions, because really what you're trying to get at is the amount of carbon that would be in the fuel that you're using. So if you have fuel consumption directly, it's a more accurate calculation. In the absence of that, you're using proxy data, distance, and then assumptions about the efficiencies of vessels to be able to estimate emissions. So one of the assumptions is just born out of using distance-based method instead of the fuel-based method. But this is very common. It often is the types of data that's available. So pretty standard assumption, if you will. And then just to note that for emission factors themselves, they are based on average emissions by mode. There's interest and effort over time in increasing the resolution of emission factors, but just to say that for efforts as they sort of where they are now, we're looking at average across types of modes. So again, those sort of short haul versus long haul flights, not specific airplanes that we would be looking at. So just to highlight some of the preliminary findings, I think as I sort of noted already, while there's some uncertainties in these mass distance-based calculations, it can still provide valuable insights as to getting a general understanding of the emissions that are occurring by routes, by modes, and so forth. So it gives you a good understanding of shipping-related emissions using this distance-based method. And what we're finding, perhaps not surprisingly, but I think it's important to kind of reflect on the opportunity here, is that if we're moving products by air, it's considerably more emission intensive than if we're moving products by sea. And that's represented in the graphic to the right on this slide that shows that emissions are about 40 times greater based on the UK DEFRA emission factors if we're moving products in a long haul flight versus by a container ship. And so so being mindful of that, the significant difference there in emissions on an intensity basis is, something that sort of stood out through the effort. And then also becoming aware that entities such as the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is looking to move data towards making vessel fuel consumption data more available. So again, ideally we would have information on fuel consumption, and that would be a higher tier method for being able to estimate emissions. And there's a lot of interest in sort of making that those data more available. So I think that shows where things are going and what might be possible moving forward. So in addition to that port-to-port analysis of shipping emissions, we're also kind of getting back to overall scope 3 emissions, and those different source categories are aware of other opportunities to estimate emissions within the USAID global health value chain. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the thinking and some of the efforts there as well, beginning with regional distribution centers. So kind of pulling us back to this, those different source categories, and a reminder that the port analysis was looking at upstream transportation and distribution. Second half of that category is distribution. And for USA Global Health, they have 3 regional distribution centers, or RDCs, in Belgium, Dubai, and South Africa. And so engage in some efforts to start to work with the RDCs to understand the emissions associated with distribution or with warehousing goods that USAID had procured. And so we looked into obtaining primary data directly from them, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second, and also understanding what they might be doing in terms of emission reduction activities. So if they're looking at carbon offsets, or if they're looking at renewable energy and obtaining energy attributes certificates. And then for them, using those primary data information on like fuel and electricity consumption, we can calculate emissions using publicly available factors from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as other entities. And so you can get a sense of what their RDC, one of these distribution centers, overall emissions are, and then allocate a share of those emissions to USAID based on the amount of warehouse space that USAID Global Health would comprise relative to other entities. In addition to looking at those distribution emissions, we're also interested in considering what emission information might be available for embodied emissions in products that USAID would procure through pharmaceutical manufacturers. So these emissions would fall into that first category of scope 3 emissions, the purchased goods and services. And what we're looking at there would be the again, embodied emissions associated with making products. So if you're a manufacturer, within the manufacturing process, the energy or processes that go into making those products all have their emission generating activities. They also would result in emissions. So what are those emissions? And then can we look at how much of those emissions are attributed to products that are being developed? And then if USAID is purchasing those products, sort of its ownership of those emissions. So trying to understand what those types of emissions are, and to build that understanding, USAID engaged in efforts to start to talk to suppliers about their own accounting and what information may be available. So to think about this approach and how to talk to suppliers and understand their own activities, it's, I think, important to be aware that for the manufacturers, for the suppliers themselves, are also working through efforts to account for emissions. They may have an interest as a company to account for those emissions. There may be other drivers, regulatory drivers, customer drivers, investor drivers that are all sort of increasing focus on accounting for emissions. But from a buyer's perspective, in the case of USAID, to estimate emissions associated with the products that it buys, it has different tiers of methods that can be used to estimate those emissions. And they range from, on the bottom of this slide, a spend-based method, which is sort of the lowest tier. It's going to result in the least accurate emission estimates, but it's a screening point or a starting point, up to a supplier-specific method, which would be a situation where the suppliers themselves have enough of an understanding of the emissions in their own activities and that go into their own products that they're able to provide that. So as a buyer or as a customer, it's helpful to understand what methods are available, and then also through that be able to be aware of the methods that are available, so that if you're talking to suppliers, understand where they may be at in terms of their ability to provide information. So part of what we've been engaged with USAID Global Health is sort of getting a sense of what's available. Those methods here range or can be grouped into secondary data versus primary data. Ideally, if you're working in this, you want to get to a point where you could get primary data. But where I'd say industry as a whole is at this point is that we're mostly reliant on secondary data. And secondary data is proxy data, such as the amount of money that's being spent to acquire, to buy goods and services, and then average emission factors. So as an example, if I'm buying apparel, I might know the amount that's being spent on that, and then there are average emission factors for the apparel industry of, per dollar spent, what are the emissions? So that's a spend-based method. It's secondary data. The goal would be to move to primary data, where you're actually getting for every product an understanding of the carbon in it. And so part of this work was to understand where the industry's at, where the suppliers are at in terms of their own accounting. So to dig into that just a little bit more and look at it from a company's perspective or from a manufacturer's perspective, we are all sort of growing in our ability to account for emissions, and there are different types of or ways to account for emissions and different purposes for the types of accounting that's done. So I think part of the value of the work that's being done here and that we can all engage in is becoming more familiar with the terminology, becoming more familiar with the types of accounting that happens, so that if you're looking at publicly disclosed emissions data, you have a sense of what that data is telling you. And so that's been part of the effort here, both for USAID Global Health to have that understanding, and then also for suppliers to be making sure we're having a similar understanding, so that if we're using terminology, we're all talking about the same thing. If we're looking at emission estimates, we know what we're looking at. So what I wanted to share here was from a company's perspective of how they may be thinking about emissions. And it goes back to that initial graphic where I broke out different sources of emissions into scope 1, 2, and 3. And so a company may prepare an organizational inventory where it too looks at its scope 1 and 2 emissions, those emissions that are closer to home, and it's starting to look at its own value chain and account for scope 3 emissions. And then if you're a manufacturer, you're making products, and you can say over time the amount of your own emissions as a company that would go into making individual products. But those are different things. There's an organizational inventory, and then there's what we're calling, or what is called within the industry, a product carbon footprint that would talk about some of the emissions that are embedded in that product. And that looks at everything upstream all the way through to the company's scope 1 and 2 emissions. But you can also do a life cycle analysis that would look further downstream at emissions associated with the use of that product and end-of-life disposal. So I think as we sort of move into thinking about the broader value chain and engaging suppliers, part of what's helpful is just raising awareness and visibility into the different types of accounting that's happening and the different purposes that they serve, and to make sure that have an understanding of what might be available within the industry, and also making sure that we're all using similar and appropriate terminology so that we have an understanding of the data that's being collected. So just wanted to touch on some of the opportunities for mitigation or emission reductions that came out of the work. And I think beginning with the part of the value of all of this is getting back to that, what you hear all the time, you can't manage what you don't measure philosophy. It's that as we look into the value chain and start to estimate scope 3 emissions from these supply chain sources, we have greater visibility into emissions across the value chain, and you start to understand the magnitude of the emissions and where the opportunities may lie for emission reductions. So the opportunity to reduce emissions just begins with understanding where those emissions are and some differentiation up to the magnitude of emissions. And through that, you can begin to encourage operational improvements. So identifying areas where emissions might be greater and asking questions about, are there opportunities to increase energy efficiency in those processes? Are there opportunities to move more of the energy demand to electrification and source renewable energy so that the emissions are zero in those cases? So looking for operational improvements that are kind of driven by what you're finding within the data. Again, sort of thinking back to the difference of like the air and sea emissions intensity. And then I also think that it's important to understand the regional regulatory context. So around the world, there's different efforts by governments now to encourage or require disclosures around greenhouse gas emissions. So in the European, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive requires disclosure of emissions by companies, similar with the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Report in India. And in the United States, there's the proposed rule from the SEC that would require public companies to disclose their emissions as well. So I think it's also important to understand that as there's that regulatory push for disclosing emissions, that you have a greater understanding of emissions from different companies, from different entities, and understanding those emissions supports being able to figure out where the opportunities lie for reducing them. And then when we look into category 4 and upstream transportation and distribution, and it sort of came through that shipping by sea is going to be less emissive than by air on an intensity basis, so where operationally viable. So thinking about if a product doesn't have to get there quickly, can we kind of shuffle the shipping practices to maybe move it by sea if that's an option? And so there's significant emission reduction opportunities or saving that can happen there. And then reducing the freight weight through things like reduced packaging. The idea here being that if we're going back to thinking about, it's how much you're moving and how heavy that is, and then how far it's going that results in the emissions. What are the opportunities to reduce how heavy it is? Because if things aren't as heavy, it's not placing as much of a burden on the vessel that has to move it, so that vessel can move more efficiently. So what opportunities lie in reducing packaging to reduce freight and other efforts to reduce freight weight. And then also encouraging low carbon alternatives. So being supportive of efforts to adopt things like sustainable aviation fuels or hydrogen, for example. And then lastly, just I think, again, with the interest of the more you measure, the better you can manage, being aware of efforts to move towards collecting primary data, fuel consumption data, in this case, from vessels. So any high resolution data that's going to result in more accurate emission estimates ultimately results in more informed decision making. So I think with that, I'll just say thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work that we've been engaged in with USAID Global Health, and I'll turn it back to you, Becky.
Thank you so much, Chris. Excellent presentation. We've had a few questions come into the chat in the Q&A function, but I wanted to first allow folks, if you'd like to come off mute to kick off our discussion. Would anyone like to verbalize a question, or I'm happy to move along to our chat? Just use the raise hand function. Let's see. I do see a hand. Is it Jose Palacios?
Yes, hi,
Over to you.
I am. Yes, I'm with the Partnership for Supply Chain Management. And I was wondering, regarding all these considerations that USAID is putting forward, how they are built into the climate change, increase in the environment, and also in the areas, in the conflicts, humanitarian, how everything is put into the framework of these regulations and requirements. This is just for discussion, obviously, but just wanted to make sure that that is brought up to you guys. Thank you.
Okay, before we go to that part too, Jose, I see your question in the, and maybe we'll build on that, because I see your question also in the chat. Just for the audience, regarding the proposed changes to the FAR also that's mentioned on one of the slides. How does USAID envision the implementation and compliance with the current environment compliance regulations? And I think Jose is building on that too, to say, how would we differentiate for humanitarian or emergency effort? So while I can't speculate, because the FAR has not changed yet, I can't speculate on the implementation and the report types. What I can say is that in order to achieve a 65% reduction in emission by FY 2030, our M Bureau is coordinating operational area specific targets. We've set them for FY 25, and these are internal. So the fact that we've baselined our supply chain emissions whilst scope 3 is still optional. So there is not an executive order mandating that reporting. Again, we're waiting on the guidance from GSA, CEQ, and OMB. We've set internal targets that can help achieve the overall agency 65% reduction, noting that, you know, our supply chain emissions account for a large portion of total emissions. And another one of our internal targets we've set is to institutionalize a decision support tool that can help further mitigate GHG emissions. But one thing I can share that was released publicly, I'm going to put it into the chat, is during the 28th Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was November to December of last year, USAID made various announcements for our public commitments that are keeping us on track to achieve this 65% reduction rate. In terms of, let me put this in the chat to everybody. I hope you can see that link. In terms of, and maybe I'll let Chris let you also speak to this a little bit, but I think building on, I think Martha put into the chat, assume that humanitarian response efforts are prioritized and thus time to arrival is critical and maybe more carbon intensive, but acceptable. Again, the scope 3 emissions are not required yet, which is how most of our goods are moved, even for humanitarian crises. And I would be speaking a bit out of turn because our humanitarian efforts are handled out of the Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, which is different from the Bureau for Global Health. But we work with them on the methodology used to estimate GHG emissions. And I know that they're working on mitigation recommendations such as pre-positioning of goods. So better planning, better demand sensing. The more you can do there is also greening packaging and aiming to remove secondary packaging where applicable. So Chris, I don't know if you want to build on that, and also would couple it with John's comment that, let's see, going to the chat, with, you know, reference to, are there some situations for which air freight's unavoidable? Thinking of low volume, short shelf life. So in addition to humanitarian crises, right? And is there a way to distinguish that in the data and analysis with how we would continue to track and monitor over time? There's a note that we often have to balance waste and expiry loss with volume efficiencies and other things like minimum order quantity. And then on the downstream side for mitigation, are there opportunities related to right-sizing product inventories that could contribute to decreasing carbon footprint, like reducing expiry? So wanted to give you a chance to comment there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think you said it very well, Becky, and the maybe one way of that I think about it is that what we're bringing to the table as part of this work is to also be able to share the carbon considerations. So USAID, other federal agencies, companies have to balance a lot of factors in their decision making. You know, they have to think about costs, they have to think about mission criticality, you have to think about these varying factors. And historically, there wasn't the information available to also incorporate carbon considerations into that decision making. And so now that becomes part of the consideration as well. That's what's coming through within this. And so But that doesn't mean, and this is just me speaking here, but that doesn't mean that then the carbon consideration is paramount, that it trumps everything else into the decision making, but it is something else that can inform the decision makers. And that relates then to opportunities like the ones you had presented, Becky, like repositioning of goods. So in the absence of knowing that, maybe that opportunity thinking that way about what other tactics might be used hadn't come up before, but this sort of raises or allows for that conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. So we have another one here from Martin Smith. Chris, you looked at regional distribution centers, and I think you touched on this a little, but has work been done on whether and how these might be optimized in terms of reducing emissions? So there's a focus on the upstream production and the downstream transportation, because that's really the bulk of emissions. But if we look at the storage and the regional distribution centers themselves, are there thoughts there? And then I would also jump and add the one in the chat from John on primary transportation as likely the biggest contributor, but also savings, to Martin's point, in warehousing and local distribution, even record-keeping communications, other areas to explore. So I wonder if you might touch on what we didn't cover in the scope of this presentation, but we're also looking at a pilot for estimating in-country distribution, which would get more of the primary mode of transport as well as in-country storage. So wanted to offer an opportunity to comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think those are all sort of exactly focused in on where opportunities lie. And so for the regional distribution centers, I think that through this engagement, we were finding that many of them are already aware of their own sort of opportunities to reduce emissions, for example, by procuring renewable energy. So it feels like that work is happening, but part of what this effort does, and what this effort especially was focused on, is understanding those emissions. So it hadn't yet gotten to the point of specific engagements around looking to reduce those emissions. But to your point, Becky, about sort of the in-country transportation, what all of this analysis is doing is for USAID starting to give insight into the rough magnitude or rough order of magnitude of emissions from these different activities within the value chain. So shipping versus warehousing within RDCs versus the embodied emissions that go into product manufacturing versus the in-country travel. And so that's half of the equation, is understanding, well, where are the largest emissions? The other half of the equation is understanding if that also translates into the largest opportunity to reduce emissions. There becomes an engagement effort where we're understanding and thinking about that particular entity's levers for reducing emissions. Do they have opportunities to increase energy efficiency, to transition to renewables, or is that particular sector maybe more constrained in its abilities? So I think the next part of the effort can be adding to an understanding of the emission profile. What are the emission reduction strategies, or what are the emission reduction opportunities, and kind of thinking of it from a sectoral or organizational or entity basis, and then involving that in decision making around emission reduction strategies.
Thank you so much, Chris. Someone else agrees with you and your points in the chat. Is there anyone else we have 1 minute left? We might be able to squeeze one more question. That's everything I've received in the chat. It's been an excellent discussion. I wonder, Safi, if you would like me to turn it over to you to close this out.
Sure. Thank you so much, Becky and Chris, for this wonderful discussion. On top of the presentation, it really helps our community to learn more about USAID's priorities, as well as the great work that's already being done. And this will hopefully lead us towards, in the future, how our community can be of assistance. and broaden the work that's being done. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll be sharing the recording for this presentation later on. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.